Hi everyone, welcome to week 5. And this week we are still talking about constitutional foundings as well as the legitimacy of public administration. And you can see that I have that term, the legitimacy of public administration, bold-faced and italicized. That's for a reason. Because what we're talking about is not the legitimacy of governments overall. We're talking about the legitimacy of a branch of government that is not really mentioned in the Constitution, and that is administration. And so the question comes up, is public administration legitimate? I'm going to leave that question right there, and by the time we get to the end of these slides, I think you'll understand what we're talking about. I just want to, excuse me, comment right here at this point on the scholarly book review proposals coming up due in this week. Um, right now, really, I'm interested. You can see what the assignment says. I'm really interested in the book you intend to use, the book you've selected. I have had a few email questions from students, and I greatly appreciate that. And I will gladly entertain more of those. This proposal right here at this juncture, though, is designed for you to tell me what the book is, and so that I have really some assurance that you're looking at it. It is actually acceptable for you to use other literature than that contained at the end of the syllabus. However, before you do that, I'd like you to make sure that it's acceptable literature. So that means you have to get approval from me if the book is not on that book list at the end of the syllabus. So please go back and look at the full requirements for this project in total, and then use that really to base your selection, your book selection, on those requirements. Let me know if that's not clear, and I will gladly get back with you on that. Thanks. I I wanted to uh, throw in a couple of slides here about the research process, and that's because this 8050 course is, of course, one of the intro classes. And if you're in the MBA program or one of the other master's programs or the certificate program, you're going to be writing papers for every single class or doing projects. I would be surprised if there's a class you have that you don't write a paper. Most of them are research based. Um, it might be practical research, which is great, but they're still research based. So when you're in the research process, what are some things you should keep in mind? And I just wanted to put this slide in here to help you really overall. So the first thing about researching is you need to understand your audience and what your purpose is. So really, when you write anything, your audience is yourself. I mean, you are writing for yourself anytime you write something. What is it you want to know? You are writing for a professor, right? There's a paper requirement in every class, and so that professor has a purpose in mind, and you need to make sure you understand that purpose. And if you don't, you need to ask. And you're writing for your peers. Lots of times you'll be asked to present your findings, present your research. In this particular class, I have a different way of presenting that. It's not a PowerPoint presentation, though I typically will do that. So why do you do that? You do that really to help in the education process of your peers. Um, so papers are the culmination of an effort. They're not the beginning of them, right? Um, yeah, the classic kind of high school or undergraduate research paper writing technique is the paper's due on Friday, and on Thursday night you go to the library and you start researching. I mean, that's not what a research paper is. A research paper really is the culmination of you doing a lot of research. The paper is not necessarily the the most important thing, although that's what you're graded on. The research is. So beyond the requirement for this particular report, when you read this book, here's some other purposes that I would suggest that are going to come to you as you read the book. Um, so an author might present a theory. Do you want to understand that theory more deeply? Um, Do you want to understand more in depth about an area of interest within public administration? Um, do you want to argue in favor of a particular argument? That is a thesis that the author might make. It might strike you on that point that when you read particular authors, you thoroughly disagree with their thesis, and that's great. Um, this isn't a project in affirmation. If you thoroughly disagree with their thesis, my thought is that there are a lot of scholars who might feel the same. Or do you want to provide an analysis? So all these purposes sort of gel in your mind as you're reading the book. So you should be writing those things down. And the last point I want to make is the literature is your friend. It's really not just a requirement of this project or any other project. Um, I ask you to look at scholarly sources that talk to the particular book that you're reviewing and the arguments that the author is making, um, simply because you need to understand how that literature fits in with the broader scope of the literature. It's a real um, it's a real thing that people do. They look at literature that reinforces their point of view, and you really shouldn't do that. You need to look at the the broader literature, because what happens is a literature review leads to more literature. And I've mentioned this before, I think, in lectures. But when you read an article, one of the things you should do in an article or a book is look at the list of references that that author is using. That that list of references leads you to more thoughts about what is being said. So literature leads to literature. And then the literature always helps you refine your approach. And this is in general when you're writing a research paper. I mean, when you're writing a paper, are you advocating something? Are you testing a theory? Are you doing a historical analysis or some other kind of analytical approach? So research is a process. So if research is a process, what are some writing practices, I should have said, that help the process? This is writing practices really. One is you should outline. And there's different ways of outlining. The Purdue OWL, for example, has a few examples of how to do an outline. Um, I outline in a more loose way. I just get out a piece of yellow paper and I start writing down a list of ideas and questions. And that helps me decide which direction my paper is going. And so that means really that an outline is very much a living document. When you outline and then you commit some of that to paper, your draft itself becomes a living document. So one of the ways, it's a little more mechanical, but it does help that you could outline this particular project, is that you could use the main headings that I have assigned in the syllabus. So there's 5 main headings, right? The introduction to the topic, the major themes or theses of the book, the connection of this book to the themes we've studied in class, the strengths and weaknesses, and the implications and influence on the study of public administration. So you could actually use this outline to help you fill in your thinking as you're reading, and then fill in the gaps as you're writing. So think about outlining this way as well. But remember that you know the research comes really before the writing. But as you're outlining, this will definitely help you put structure into what you're writing. So typically what I do in class is I require the students to make a PowerPoint presentation. Even online classes, I ask you to do a presentation with narration attached, about 12 to 15 minutes long. I'm not doing that for this particular project. I'm asking you to write what I call an extended abstract, and you're going to post that on the discussion board during the last few weeks of the class. Um, that is going to serve the process of educating your peers. So that's also a way of outlining an abstract. At the end of what you've written, writing an abstract helps you understand what you've done, and the fact that you can actually boil it down to about 2 or 3 pages. The other thing I would say that helps the process is don't procrastinate. So you've all heard this before. Um, don't procrastinate. that's that's about all I can say about that because it doesn't have good outcomes. Um, you do want to work on a paper gradually, but methodically. You really don't want to start writing this paper um, on December 1st. That's probably not a good idea. You want to be writing it as you go along. That doesn't mean that um, everything you write down is going to be included in your final paper, but the ideas might be, or probably will be. The next thing is please stay in touch with me. Nothing's worse than coming to the end of a semester and a student saying, I just don't understand this project. It, I wish you would have asked me sooner. You know, don't ask a few hours before for an extension. So the bottom line of all this is that writing is a process. It's not an event, you know, completed in 3 hours at your kitchen table. It's just not. Um, it is a process. You signed up for a graduate program, and this is kind of what you signed up for. So it writing is an important part of understanding what it is you're learning. So that's the end of my spiel on that. This is a little redundant to something I reminded you of at the beginning of the presentation, but again, the proposal's due Saturday, February 10th. Talked all through that. I did grade your journals, as you can see, so you can kind of get a feel for what I'm looking for in the journals. The journals really are an essential part of the writing element of this course. However, what they're really about, deeper than that, deeper than just a grade, is that this is the chance for you to really explore in writing how you feel about some of these topics and some of the literature that we are exploring in the course. So take that in the spirit that it's given, that of course I do grade your journals, but it's really you're writing the journal for a deeper purpose, which is to help yourself understand some of this literature. And as you move through the MPA course overall, that will help you. I think you'll find when you go back and you reference this literature in later courses. So this week's readings, you can see what I've assigned you. These three main articles, plus a couple of supplemental readings that I have on Canvas, are really about an argument about constitutional foundings. So that's what this lecture is about, constitutional foundings. And this lecture, of course, supplements the readings. So I think what you'll find with this lecture and with the readings, you're really going to have a much deeper intellectual appreciation for the Constitution really as a founding event, as Rohr would have it, versus just a document that we all revere. So please do all those readings and take a look at those supplemental readings as well. And let me launch right into the meat of the lecture. Okay, so we've been talking about this for a couple of weeks, actually, week 4 and this week. This idea of constitutional foundings, right? So the Constitution, just say that word, the Constitution. That is a loaded term anymore, isn't it? Um, People use that term, the Constitution, sometimes like they use terms like love and war and hate and art. It means something to them, and it might mean something very emotional to them. It's also like the term democracy. These are terms that are loaded. They have meaning to the individuals who say them, but not everybody else understands necessarily what they are saying when they use the term Constitution. And so that's one of the things that Spicer and Terry and John Rohr and Cam Stivers are arguing about. You know, what is the meaning of all this? What's the meaning of the Constitution? So one of the best places to start, I think, are the Federalist Papers. And we talked about where the Federalist Papers came from. They are a series of opinion pieces published in newspapers, mostly in New York. that advocated the ratification of the United States Constitution in 1788. They were directed particularly at the people who would be going to the Constitutional Convention in New York State and also in Virginia, who were going to vote on ratifying the Constitution. And so they're opinion pieces, but they're also explanatory pieces. So really, I think I said this before, but the Federalist Papers themselves are something like the owner's manual of the Constitution. You know, you buy your car, your brand new car, you hop in, you turn it on, all these indicator lights come on. They're all symbols. You don't know what they mean. You have to get in the owner's manual and see, okay, this is what the little light bulb means. This is what the squiggly line means. This is what all these indicators in a car mean, right? Something's wrong or something's right with the engine or some electrical system or something else. Well, the Federalist Papers themselves actually endeavored to explain what the people who gathered in 1787 in Philadelphia that summer meant to say. The papers themselves are considerably longer than the Constitution itself. So there's a lot of explanation. And it's of note that many Supreme Court and other court decisions quote and rely on the Federalist Papers. So they're of importance. They're technically not part of the Constitution, but they have meaning that directly relates to the Constitution. So there's three that you read: Federalist number 10, 17, and 51. These are really important ones, but they're all important, and you should maybe buy the book. You can get the book for less than $10 on Amazon. So Federalist number 10, what is it that Madison meant by faction? Right? He says, by a faction, I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. So this is really interesting. Did Madison think factions were political parties? Perhaps, but maybe not. Maybe he thought factions were actually something dangerous. And so there's always this question what he meant by faction. What are, in his writing, what are the permanent and aggregate interests of the community? What did he mean by that? The permanent and aggregate interests of the community. Is he talking about what we would call public value? Is he talking about the majority rules? What's he talking about? And then are factions temporary phenomena, or are they permanent, like political parties? So let's remember that in Madison's time, there were the beginnings actually of political parties. There were disagreements initially about the Constitution. There were the Federalists. Madison was a Federalist, so called because he wanted the federal Constitution ratified. There were anti-Federalists. They were not anti-American, they were anti-Federalists. In fact, after the Constitution was ratified, the people who were opposed to ratification, the so-called anti-Federalists, many of them still served in Congress. They were part of the revolutionary generation. They were patriots, but they were anti-Federalists. Was he talking about regional differences? It's very clear when you read the Constitution that there was compromise between North and South, particularly on the issue of slavery. I mean, that is very clear in the Constitution. Manufacturing versus agriculture. Alexander Hamilton, for example, was very pro-manufacturing. Was it Republicans versus Democrats? Well, they didn't exist then, but they soon did. And so how are factions controlled? So what Madison says in number 10 is one of the ways to do that is remove the effect through structure. So the structure of the constitutional republic promotes what we would call today interest group pluralism. That means factions can actually counterbalance each other. And the other part of the structure is federalism itself. So national questions are resolved at the national level, state questions at the state level. In all, what Madison is talking about in number 10 is that interests balance against interest. So read that for yourself again and try to understand what you think Madison was saying. Okay, and then there's Federalist 17. Um, this is written by Hamilton, we think. And so what Hamilton was interested in the roles of the national government, what we call the federal government, versus state governments. Um, so here's a really important point to recognize about the Federalist Papers. The Anti-Federalists made a really strong case that this new Constitution written in 1787 would basically gut the power and role of the state governments. And so there really was a tradition in the United States of power at the state level because each state, recall, was a colony. Each of those colonies had a specific and direct relationship with the crown and with parliament. And so each of those states and the people who were the elites in those states, they were people who thought of themselves as leaders of perhaps a semi-sovereign entity. The Anti-Federalists really wanted to retain the power of the states. Hamilton, on the other hand, was interested more in central power for very specific reasons, but he had to spend some time convincing the Anti-Federalists that, hey, really, this Constitution is not going to gut state power. So he said, really, that the Constitution would prevent that. What he talks about is that in 17 is that national government only had power in certain areas for administration: commerce, finance, negotiation, and war. These were very important to Hamilton. And if you read some of the other Federalist Papers that Hamilton authored, he goes into a great amount of detail actually about the role of the Navy, for example, which was to protect American commerce. He talks about the reasons why tariffs are better administered from the national government versus state governments. But what he really says in 17 is that states retain the bulk of criminal and civil justice authority, meaning that in his mind, at least at that time, the national government had almost no power in its court system for criminal and civil justice. That was really a state prerogative. He also argues that the people themselves are more attuned to the culture, loyalties, and interests of their home states. That's what I was just talking about, in terms of the history of colonial America. And so Hamilton said that power ultimately is diffuse. It is not concentrated. And he saw that as a good thing. So what he's arguing in 17 is that because power is diffuse, that means that no one entity holds too much power, and that prevents tyranny. So the question is, was Hamilton correct? And is he correct today in 2017? And if he's not, then what happened? That's a rhetorical question, but it's a good one to think about. So finally, Federalist number 51, which was written either by Madison or Hamilton, but it has some great quotes. Has some of the best quotes in all the Federalist Papers, and I like this one. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The interests of the man must be connected with the constitutional rights of the place. It may be a reflection on human nature that such devices should be necessary to control the abuses of government. But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. I mean, that is really, that's a great quote. It gets quoted all the time. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. Um, so the point here really is that ambition must be made to counteract ambition. So structure is really the answer to ambition. Um, in a republic, they say that Hamilton and Madison say the legislative authority necessarily predominates, in that it has two houses. And in fact, in another Federalist paper, Hamilton and Madison state that the executive would be the weakest branch of the government, since it really only has a veto power, which can be overridden. And so the question is this still true? Um, and the judiciary was appointed by the other two branches, but held a lifetime tenure. So it had a little bit of balance against the other two branches, but they saw that the legislature would predominate at the national level. Now, the question is that really true? And how do we continue to achieve balance at the national level? I mean, when some of you take the budget and finance class in your MPA program, you're going to talk about various budget acts that have been passed over the last, say, over the last century, since about 1920. And many of these acts that have to do with how we budget at the national level are also about struggle between Congress and the presidency for the last 100 years when it comes to budgets. And we still struggle with predominance of Congress versus the presidency when it comes to the national budget. All you have to do is watch what's going on with reference to the budgets in any presidential administration, not just this one, and you can see that this is still a very active issue. And so the other thing in Federalist 51 was that the government was to be federal. We talk about the federal government. That's really actually a misused term. It's the national government, but the whole Constitution is federal. And it really means more than three levels of government, right? In the original constitutions, in the original U.S. Constitution, the Senate represented states, not people. So think about that for a second. The House represented the people, or at least the people that could vote, which certainly wasn't all the people. But the House represented the people. The Senate represented the states. That is the interest of that corporate political entity called the state. The interests of the people and the interests of the state might be two different things. So think about that structure for a second. In the original Constitution, the president was elected in effect by state legislatures. The president was elected indirectly. That's what the Electoral College was about. The electors were generally appointed by people who had been elected to serve in state legislatures. So think about the indirectness of that. We argue about the Electoral College, and we say it's some kind of antiquated relic of the Constitution. And I think there's, people make a good argument that that's the case, because in fact, the president, as designed, was not at an office elected by all of the people. So it's really interesting how all that fits in with Federalist 51 and the idea that ambition is made to counteract ambition. So the point, if you've been following along up to now, is things have changed, right? Government's gotten a lot bigger since way back then. So here's a slide that you saw before, and I only put it in really for one reason. I think it would be surprising to Hamilton and Madison to know that today there are around 89,000 units, 89,000 entities in the fourth line, way over to the right under 2012 of that table there. 89,000 units that can legitimately call themselves governments of some kind, meaning that they have some jurisdiction, some authority, and generally have some taxing power over some defined tax base. I don't think Hamilton and Madison envisioned this. Um, so that's interesting. That's one thing that's changed. Here's another slide that I've shown you before, but I actually modified it a little bit. I drew some lines through things and highlighted some other things. So um, I showed you this slide before to talk about where the concentration of government spending is, today. But look at the areas that I drew lines through, meaning, and I forgot to explain this, but we do things today that we didn't used to do, right? Like we used to do, we never did space travel, right? They weren't envisioning NASA. Um, but there were things that were done at the federal, state, and local levels. So at the federal level, yes, Hamilton, in fact, argued that national defense is a national government responsibility. He argued against the idea that each of the states should decide defense policy on behalf of the rest of the country, even de facto. So, he didn't want New York getting into a war that Virginia wasn't involved in, right? But interestingly, the idea of defense in 1788 was different than our idea of defense today. We have a Department of Homeland Security and a Department of Defense. In 1788, they were really the same thing. Homeland Security meant securing the borders and having a navy to protect American shipping. That's what defense and Homeland Security rolled into one meant in 1788. There was no difference. There was no international United States force that was stationed in Europe and the Middle East and everywhere else. There was no blue water navy as we know it today. That is not what they envisioned. Veteran services, that's an interesting one. You see, I have this little line that comes from the state level to the national level because, in fact, the care of wounded veterans had always been a colonial and then a state responsibility, and that's a responsibility that the national government took upon itself, not with the writing of the Constitution, but just a few years after the writing of the Constitution, when the early Congresses agreed to pick up the pay for wounded veterans, and later that became, not very much later, a national responsibility. The Postal Service was a very important aspect, actually, of the national government. One of the few things that was really mentioned in the Constitution as an important issue because that was our means of communication. At the state level, yes, states were involved in higher education, but in a limited way. The University of Virginia, as the first state sponsored school officially, wasn't until after several years after the Constitution. Welfare was limited. There were actually forms of welfare administered at the state level, not like they are today. Highways, limited. Again, a lot of volunteerism was involved in that. Corrections, yes, states did put people in jail after they were tried for crimes, and they executed people after they were tried for what were called capital crimes, but there was little, if any, of a national criminal justice system. And at the local level, yeah, we did have libraries. Famously, Ben Franklin came up with public libraries. We did have small police departments or constables. Fire departments were mostly voluntary. Parks, they were spotty. Boston Commons was the first public park. Sanitation and utilities, which we were used to seeing at the local level, that was really by the late 1800s, about 100 years after the Constitution, we started thinking about those things. But up to then, it was individuals figuring out how to deal with those problems by themselves. So the point is that government spending, as it existed, was limited. Yeah, a lot of the same responsibilities were at these levels, but the spending itself was more limited, and people who thought about what governments should do didn't even consider a lot of the things today that we consider vital, like Social Security. Social Security gets argued about. I doubt personally that it's ever going to be done away with. It's seen as a national government responsibility. You have seen this chart before too, and the only point I want to make on this is that federal aid or national government aid to states really just wasn't something that was considered at the founding of the republic. They were seen as separate entities. So the only federal aid uh, really was that at the founding of the Constitution, the national government agreed to pick up the war debt of the states, which did actually help the states tremendously. But um, the growth of federal aid to the states really started occurring after the New Deal in the 1930s and 1940s. So given this, okay, so given that the circumstances of our society have changed tremendously since 1787, the question is, the overriding question for the readings that I assigned you this week, these three readings, how do Rohr, Spicer and Terry, and Stivers, how do these works illuminate our current understanding of the Constitution and the Federalist Papers and the founding era of the United States within the construct of public administration? So the next three slides, I just have some questions I want you to consider. I'm not really going to give you answers. I'm not going to tell you what I think the answers are. Um, Thinking about Rohr and Stivers and Spicer and Terry, this is going to come up again in a later journal. For now, really, I just want this to be a thought piece. So what is legitimacy versus legality in the Rohr piece? Where does sovereignty reside? Is the legislature supreme in the U.S. Republic? What is Rohr talking about when he's discussing officers and representatives? Here's a really important question when you're reading Rohr. Are elections the only way of conferring legitimacy? A great one is why is Rohr critical of Wilson and how does he interpret good now? Because you just spent some time doing that yourself. And how is public administration an invention of the Constitution and thus legitimized by the Constitution? So when you read it, Spicer and Terry, here's some other things to think about. Spicer and Terry talk about this idea of the romanticized view of the founders, and they criticize Rohr um, because of this view, right? And they replace it with something they call the logic of a constitution or logic of constitutions. So what do they mean by that? Um, what criticisms do they level against the founders? And so how do they end up ultimately defining a constitution? And then in their writing, how is public administration legitimized? So finally, Stivers, what does she say about the blind spots of the founders? Um, what does she say when she's talking about instrumentalism in the Constitution? That's a really important question in her work. Um, what does she say about the various compromises that the founders made in order to actually pass the Constitution? And what is it she says about the Constitution as principle and not necessarily a blueprint? That's actually just really important in this work, this idea of Constitution as principle. And so then, in her view, how is public administration legitimized? So the point is, all three of these works legitimize or suggest, I guess, that public administration is legitimized in slightly different ways. And so this is what I want you to think about. So here's a thought piece for you. This actually might come up again, but this is one you should think about because we hear about this all the time, right? We hear talk often by people running for office and by people elected to office. We hear talk of unelected judges, who make decisions affecting average citizens at all levels of government, right? We hear about things like, these are examples, Common Core learning criteria for K-12 education. And people say this is flawed because the standards were dreamed up by what they call unaccountable bureaucrats in Washington who really know nothing about public schools at the local level. And if you actually pick up a newspaper and read letters to the editor at a local source, you'll see complaints of things like lazy road workers not fixing potholes. I just saw 10 city workers fixing one pothole and 9 of them were standing leaning on their shovels. Okay. We know today in the United States that various police departments have come under sharp criticism for using unnecessary force, including lethal force, particularly against minority citizens. And so police departments are seen in the eyes of a lot of people as being illegitimate. So these are a few examples, and you certainly can think of others, but here's the point. With all that in mind, and with everything that Spicer and Terry said, and Rohr and Stivers said, what legitimizes public administration? And so it's really important to realize here that I'm not talking about elected people. I'm not talking about people elected to the city council or the state legislature or Congress or the presidency. I'm talking about people who aren't elected, people like some of us who serve in public administration in appointed levels or hired levels. What legitimizes us as public administrators? And so that's what I want you to circle back with in these 3 pieces is this idea of legitimacy of public administration. So here's the blank slide that you've all been waiting for. I do have a question on Spicer and Terry, Rohr, and Stivers in the discussion board this week. So please use this lecture to help you think through these ideas and then share your ideas with each other. I'm looking forward to seeing what you have in mind. Also, of course, looking forward to your scholarly book review proposals. Please do contact me, as always, with any questions. Thanks.